In the last video, we looked at what are some potential uses and benefits of using functions, and we also looked at how we can actually use some of the pre-coded functions in Python, such as ABS, which is the short form for absolute, as well as minimum. In this video, we will move on to showing you how you can create a function and then call it. So the syntax of a function is very straightforward. It always starts with def. So just like a loop always begins with either a for or a while, functions always begin with def. Following that, we have the function name. So the function name, like you saw earlier, in order to create an absolute function, the function name was abs. Here, you can create your own function name. So you can name it the function monkey or calculator or addition or whichever function you would like to use, as long as it's not a keyword. Finally, we need to tell the function how many and what inputs to take. That comes in the bracket inputs section. So if you saw the previous absolute function, it takes a number, whether negative or positive. Similarly, in your function, you may or may not need to take in an input. After you define a function, this is the code that you will run whenever this function is called. Lastly, the function ends when you actually include this word return. This brings it back to wherever the function was called. After we have defined a function, we can call it, and we can use whatever function name we have defined. So previously was abs, now you can call whichever function you use, and we can insert inputs in as required. Inputs are not mandatory, meaning that if in the definition you did not include any inputs, when you call it, you can also choose not to include, or rather you should not include any inputs. So that's the basic syntax of a function. Let's take a look at an example. So if we wanted to declare a function called breakfast, we start with the def keyword defining. Breakfast is the name of the function, and in this case, the function does not take any inputs. Therefore, we put only the empty brackets. So after the colon, we only print sperm and eggs, and we return to the location it is called. So let's take a look at this in Jupyter Notebook. So if we are running the definition breakfast, sperm and eggs, notice that it does not actually print sperm and eggs. This only defines the function. In order to print sperm and eggs, we need to call it. So to call it, we need to remember its name. In this case, it's breakfast with a bracket. If there are no inputs, just an empty bracket would do. And when you run this line, you will see the sperm and eggs appear. So just one more thing, when it returns back to the location that they called it. So meaning that if I have another line after this, done with breakfast, what happens when I run this is that they see the word breakfast, it goes into the function, prints sperm and eggs, comes back to the location it was called before again printing I'm done with breakfast. So that is the order or the sequence in which the code runs.
Let's take a look at another simple example. So let's take a look at this function called Apple Finder, and based on the code before I review the answer, can you guess what this function does? Yes, Apple Finder simply prints out whether the word that is being passed into this function is the word apple. So let's take a look at the Jupyter Notebook. Again, we have defined, we use the word define to help us specify that we are going to declare a function. we input the name of the function and the input that will be passed into this function. And if the value or the input passed into this function contains the word apple, then it says yes, this is an apple, otherwise no, this is not an apple. So after I define or declare the function, I can call it and it will indicate whether this word that I'm passing into the function is apple. So even if I put pineapple, it says that this is not an apple. So again, in order to call the function, I need to know its name and pass in the correct number of inputs in the bracket. Okay, one last example that we are going to look at before we go into the next video. So here we have a function that prints out the last letter of any string. Therefore, I have named this function last letter. It takes in one input, which is a string that can also function as a list. So if you remember one of your previous lessons, we talked about a list. Here we are teaching you something new where a string also doubles up as a list. And the index of the list will determine which letter we are making reference to. 0 is the first letter, 1 is the second, and so on. Let's dive straight into Jupyter Notebook where I can explain more clearly. So for example, if word 1 equals to PENT, so this is a string. But at the same time, as we have mentioned earlier, a string is also a list. Therefore, I can call the name of the variable and put in square brackets which index I'm referencing. So if I'm referencing the 0 index, that is the first alphabet. Therefore, this is for P. If I'm looking for 1, then this is E. And if I'm looking for the last, then this is 3. If you remember, inside your list lesson, we also taught you this function called length. And whenever we are using the function length, this gives us how many characters there are or how many values there are inside this list. So because there are 4 alphabets here, the length gives us 4. Okay, so before we continue, we need to first define the function. So we define the function and name it last letter, taking in one input called word. And it prints out word, and in this square or in these square brackets, which index we are looking for. So as we have seen earlier, length of word will always tell us how many letters there are. -1, that gives us 1 less than the maximum. So if I pass in the word pen, it will take 4 minus 1, which is 3. And in the index 3, you see that it's a T. So if I call last letter and pen, you will see that it's the letter T. But this function is not limited to only identifying the last letter in 4-letter words. You can also use the 5-letter words, and it will actually show you the number, or rather the final alphabet. And that's because we are using a dynamic function which is called length to help us determine how many characters they are and which item or which value we should be referencing. So depending on, in order to call our function, again we need to know the name of the function followed by how many inputs there are. So in this case it's 1, so it accepts the this is a valid call. Let's look at some common errors when we use functions. So we need to know that just like variables, the name of the function is also case sensitive, so we cannot be using a capital L when we define it as a small letter L. Next, when we actually pass in the wrong type of value in the middle of the function, because they are expecting a string, an integer is not a list, therefore they are throwing this error. if we throw in or we input or we call the function with an inappropriate number of inputs, so instead of 1 we pass in 2, we get this thing called a type error, where it's saying that we are expecting 1 input but actually 2 were given. So that brings us to the end of the section on how to actually call and create our own functions. In the next video, we will learn more about returning a value. See you